In the Bronze Age, when gods walked among mortals and heroes carved their names into eternity with sword and spear, there stood upon the windswept shores of Asia Minor a city that would become legend, a fortress whose very name would echo through the corridors of time until the end of days, Troy, the mighty citadel that commanded the narrow strait between two seas and held dominion over the passage between Europe and Asia. Within its towering walls of fitted stone, King Priam ruled with wisdom earned through decades of peace and prosperity. His palace adorned with treasures from distant lands, his treasury overflowing with gold and silver, his armories filled with the finest weapons that mortal smiths could forge. The king had been blessed by the gods with many sons, each a warrior of renown, but none more celebrated than Hector, whose courage in battle was matched only by his devotion to family and duty, and Paris, whose beauty had been remarked upon by mortals and immortals alike since the day of his birth. Yet it was this very beauty that would bring doom upon the greatest city in the known world, for the gods in their infinite wisdom and terrible caprice had woven a fate that would see Troy's mighty walls reduced to rubble and ash, its people scattered to the winds, and its name spoken only in whispers of what once was. The tale begins not with the clash of bronze upon bronze or the thunder of 10,000 hooves upon the plain, but in the golden halls of Mount Olympus where the gods held court and decided the fates of mortals with the casualness of children at play. Zeus the Thunderer, king of gods and master of the sky, had grown weary of the endless petty squabbles among the immortals and had decreed that a great wedding should be celebrated to bring peace to the divine realm. Peleus, a mortal king beloved by the gods for his virtue and courage, was to wed Thetis, a sea nymph whose beauty rivaled that of the goddesses themselves, and all the immortals were invited to witness this union of mortal and divine. Yet in their pride and thoughtlessness, the gods neglected to extend an invitation to Eris, the goddess of discord and strife, whose very nature made her unwelcome at celebrations of harmony and joy. Enraged by this slight, Eris appeared uninvited at the wedding feast, her dark robes billowing like storm clouds, her eyes flashing with malevolent fire, and upon the table where the immortals feasted she cast a golden apple, perfectly formed and gleaming like captured sunlight, upon which were inscribed the words "For the fairest," in letters that seemed to burn with their own inner light. Immediately 3 goddesses reached for the apple, each certain that she alone deserved such recognition, each prepared to fight for what she believed was rightfully hers. Hera, queen of the gods and wife to Zeus, whose regal bearing and commanding presence had made her the undisputed mistress of Olympus, declared that as queen of heaven she was obviously the most beautiful and deserved the apple without question. Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, whose keen intellect and martial prowess had earned her the respect even of her father Zeus, argued that true beauty lay not in mere appearance but in the perfection of mind and spirit that she embodied. Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty, whose very presence could drive mortals mad with desire and whose smile could launch 1,000 ships, laughed at her rival's claims and insisted that beauty was her very essence and dominion. The quarrel that erupted between these 3 goddesses shook the pillars of Olympus itself, and Zeus, wise in the ways of divine politics and knowing that any choice he made would earn him the eternal enmity of 2 of the most powerful goddesses, declared that the decision must be made by a mortal judge who could view the matter with unbiased eyes. The choice fell upon Paris, prince of Troy, who at that time lived not in his father's palace but as a simple shepherd upon the slopes of Mount Ida, having been cast out in infancy due to a prophecy that he would bring destruction upon his native city. The young prince, unaware of his true identity and content with his pastoral life among the flocks, was approached by Hermes, messenger of the gods, who led him to a sacred grove where the 3 goddesses awaited his judgment. Each divine lady presented herself in all her glory, each argued her case with words honeyed and persuasive, each offered the young shepherd a bribe that would have made him the envy of all mortals. Hera promised him dominion over all of Asia and Europe, the power to command kings and emperors, the wealth of nations laid at his feet. Athena offered him wisdom beyond that of all other mortals, victory in every battle he might fight, glory that would last until the end of time. But Aphrodite, most cunning of the 3, offered him something that no mortal man could resist, the love of the most beautiful woman in all the world, a passion so perfect and complete that it would eclipse all other joys and sorrows. Paris, young and filled with the fires of youth, chose Aphrodite's gift without hesitation, and in doing so he sealed not only his own fate but the fate of 2 mighty civilizations. The most beautiful woman in the world was Helen, daughter of Zeus himself, whose legendary beauty had already caused more wars and bloodshed than any mortal woman before or since. When she came of age, suitors from every corner of the known world journeyed to Sparta to compete for her hand, princes and kings laying their crowns at her feet, warriors of renown offering their swords in her service. Her foster father, King Tyndareus of Sparta, fearing that choosing any one suitor would earn him the enmity of all the others, required each man to swear a sacred oath that he would respect Helen's choice of husband and come to the aid of her chosen spouse should any harm befall her. The suitors, blinded by Helen's beauty and desperate to win her favor, agreed to this condition without fully understanding its implications. Helen chose Menelaus, brother to the mighty Agamemnon, and the wedding was celebrated with great joy and magnificent gifts from rulers across the Mediterranean. For several years the royal couple lived in happiness, blessed with a daughter and enjoying the prosperity and peace that came with Menelaus's just rule over Sparta. But the gods had not forgotten Paris or the promise that Aphrodite had made in exchange for the golden apple. The goddess of love began to weave her spells around the young prince, filling his dreams with visions of a woman whose beauty surpassed that of all mortal maidens, whose very name whispered by the wind seemed to call to his heart across the vast distances that separated them. Eventually Paris was reunited with his royal family in Troy. His true identity revealed and his position as prince restored, but the longing that Aphrodite had planted in his heart only grew stronger with time. When King Priam decided to send an embassy to Sparta to negotiate a treaty of friendship and trade, Paris volunteered to lead the mission, though his true purpose was to seek out the woman of his dreams. The gods smiled upon his voyage, sending favorable winds and calm seas, and when his ships appeared in the harbor at Sparta, they were welcomed with a courtesy due to ambassadors from so great and powerful a city as Troy. Menelaus received the Trojan embassy with honor, ordering great feasts to be prepared and opening his palace to his guests with the generosity that was expected of a king. But when Paris first laid eyes upon Helen as she entered the great hall dressed in robes of finest silk and adorned with jewels that caught the torchlight like captured stars, he knew that Aphrodite had kept her promise. Here was beauty beyond all mortal understanding, grace that made the very air shimmer around her, a presence that seemed to illuminate the entire room with its radiance. Helen too felt the pull of divine magic, for Aphrodite had prepared her heart to receive the Trojan prince, and when their eyes met across the crowded hall it was as if the rest of the world ceased to exist. The goddess of love laughed with triumph as her carefully laid plans began to unfold, as two hearts that had been shaped by her divine will recognize their destined union. For several days the embassy continued its official business while Paris and Helen conducted a courtship under the very nose of her unsuspecting husband, meeting in gardens and secluded chambers, speaking in whispers of love that had been ordained by the gods themselves. Aphrodite's magic grew stronger with each passing hour, weaving bonds of passion that no mortal will could break, until neither Paris nor Helen could imagine life without the other. When Menelaus announced that urgent business called him away from Sparta for several days, Paris and Helen saw their opportunity and seized it without thought for the consequences. On a night when the moon hid her face behind clouds as if ashamed to witness what was about to unfold, Helen fled from her husband's palace carrying only a few precious possessions and her infant daughter, meeting Paris at the harbor where his ships waited with anchors ready to weigh and sails prepared to catch the wind. By dawn they were far from Spartan shores, sailing eastward toward Troy and a love that would cost more lives than any passion in the history of the world. When Menelaus returned to find his wife gone and his palace empty of its most precious treasures, his rage shook the very foundations of Sparta. But his first thought was not of personal revenge but of the sacred oaths that Helen's suitors had sworn so many years before, oaths that bound them to come to his aid in exactly such circumstances as these. Messengers were dispatched to every corner of Greece, carrying word of Helen's abduction and calling upon the oath-bound kings to honor their commitments. Some came willingly, eager for glory and plunder, while others had to be persuaded or even coerced. But one by one the heroes of Greece began to gather at the port of Aulis where a great fleet was being assembled under the command of Agamemnon, Menelaus's brother and the most powerful king in all of Hellas. Ships arrived daily from every Greek city-state and island, great black vessels with painted eyes upon their prows and crews of seasoned warriors, until the harbor bristled with so many masts that they resembled a forest of leafless trees, and the beach was covered with so many tents that they stretched beyond the horizon like a city of canvas and rope. Among the heroes who answered the call was Achilles, son of Peleus and the sea nymph Thetis, whose fame as a warrior had already spread throughout the known world despite his youth. His mother, knowing through divine prophecy that her son would die if he went to Troy, had hidden him away on the island of Scyros disguised as a maiden among the daughters of King Lycomedes, but the wily Odysseus had discovered the deception through clever trickery and convinced the young hero to join the expedition. There came also Ajax, son of Telamon, whose strength was legendary and whose shield was so large that it could shelter a dozen men, and Ajax the Lesser, swift of foot and deadly with the spear, and Diomedes whose courage in battle was second only to that of Achilles himself. Nestor, aged king of Pylos whose wisdom had guided Greece through many crises, brought both his counsel and his sons to the cause, while Odysseus of Ithaca, whose cunning mind could solve problems that brute force could not overcome, provided not only his own sword but the strategic thinking that would prove essential to Greek victory. But the gods were not content to let mortals settle this matter among themselves, for the abduction of Helen had upset the delicate balance of divine politics, and each of the great immortals chose sides according to their own interests and ancient grudges. Aphrodite, naturally, favored the Trojans since it was her meddling that had caused the war in the first place, and she was joined by Apollo, god of music and prophecy, who had always held Troy in special favor, and Ares, god of war, who cared nothing for justice but was drawn to whichever side promised the most bloodshed and glory. On the side of the Greeks stood Hera, still nursing her wounded pride over the judgment of Paris, and Athena, equally offended by the Trojan prince's choice, and Poseidon, god of the sea, who bore an ancient grudge against Troy's walls which had been built with his help but for which he had never been properly paid. Zeus himself attempted to remain neutral, but his efforts to stay above the conflict only ensured that the war would rage longer and cost more lives, as neither side could claim decisive divine support. The Greek fleet, numbering more than 1,000 ships and carrying over 100,000 warriors, should have sailed immediately for the coast of Troy, but the gods had other plans. As the vessels lay at anchor in the harbor of Aulis, the winds died away completely, leaving the sea as smooth as polished bronze and the sails hanging limp from their yards. Day after day passed without the slightest breeze, while the army consumed its supplies and began to grow restless with enforced inactivity. The priest Calchas, wisest of all mortals in reading the will of the gods, declared that Artemis, goddess of the hunt and sister to Apollo, was angry with Agamemnon for some slight and demanded a sacrifice before she would allow the winds to blow. The nature of the sacrifice he required was so terrible that strong men wept to hear it. Agamemnon must offer up his own daughter, the innocent maiden Iphigenia, upon the altar of the goddess. The King of Kings, faced with the choice between his daughter's life and the success of the expedition that would restore his family's honor, made the terrible decision that duty demanded, though it would haunt him for the rest of his days and eventually lead to his own destruction. When the sacrifice was complete and the blood of the innocent had stained the altar stone, Artemis relented and sent the winds that filled the sails of the Greek fleet and carried them across the wine-dark sea toward their destiny. The crossing took many days, during which the heroes made their final preparations for war, sharpening their weapons and offering prayers to whatever gods might favor their cause, while the poets among them composed songs of the glorious deeds they hoped to perform and the immortal fame they sought to win. As the coast of Troy finally appeared on the horizon, rising like a golden wall from the blue waters of the Hellespont, even the bravest warriors felt their hearts quicken with anticipation and fear, for they were about to begin a siege that would test the limits of human endurance and determine which of the great civilizations would survive to see another generation. The landing was opposed from the first moment the Greek ships scraped against the Trojan beach, for Hector had not been idle during the months required for his enemies to assemble their forces. The crown prince of Troy had used the time to prepare his city's defenses, strengthening the walls that had been built by divine hands, gathering supplies and weapons, and forging alliances with neighboring kingdoms who feared that Greek victory would threaten their own independence. When the first Greek warriors leaped from their ships onto the sacred soil of Troy, they were met by a wall of bronze spears and a rain of arrows that darkened the sky like a cloud of locusts. The battle raged from dawn until dusk, with heroes on both sides performing deeds that would be remembered in song for 1,000 years, but neither force could claim decisive victory. By nightfall the Greeks had established a precarious foothold on the beach and begun construction of a fortified camp, while the Trojans withdrew behind their city walls to plan their next move in what both sides now realized would be a long and terrible conflict. Thus began the siege of Troy, a war that would drag on for 10 long years and consume an entire generation of heroes. The Greeks, unable to breach the mighty walls by direct assault, settled in for a siege of attrition, building a great camp on the beach with walls and towers of their own, establishing supply lines back to their homeland, and systematically raiding the surrounding countryside to deny the Trojans food and reinforcements. The city of Troy, secure behind its legendary fortifications, prepared to wait out the siege, confident that time and disease would eventually thin the ranks of the invaders until they were forced to abandon their enterprise and sail home in defeat. But both sides had underestimated the determination of their enemies and the terrible price that would be demanded before the war could end. Year after year the conflict continued with neither army able to deliver a decisive blow against the other. The Greeks won victories in the field whenever the Trojans were foolish enough to meet them in open battle, for the warriors of Hellas were more skilled in combat and had better weapons and armor, but they could not breach Troy's walls no matter how many times they hurled themselves against those towering fortifications. The Trojans, safe within their city, could not break the Greek siege lines despite repeated attempts, and gradually their supplies dwindled and their allies began to fall away as the cost of supporting Troy became too great to bear. Heroes fell on both sides, their names added to the growing list of those who had given their lives in the struggle between East and West. And still the walls of Troy stood unbroken while the Greek ships remained drawn up on the beach like sleeping sea monsters waiting for the chance to carry their crews home. In the 9th year of the siege, a quarrel arose between Achilles and Agamemnon that nearly destroyed the Greek cause altogether. When plague struck the army, the priest Calchas revealed that Apollo was punishing the Greeks because Agamemnon had refused to return a captured Trojan maiden to her father, who served as a priest of the god. Forced to give up his prize, Agamemnon demanded that Achilles surrender his own captive, the beautiful Briseis, as compensation. Achilles, proud and quick to anger, refused to submit to what he saw as an unjust command from a king he considered his equal at best, and when Agamemnon persisted, the greatest of all Greek warriors withdrew from the fighting altogether, taking with him his fearsome Myrmidons and leaving the allied army significantly weakened at the worst possible time. The Trojans, sensing opportunity in their enemy's division, launched a series of attacks that drove the Greeks back to their ships and nearly succeeded in burning the entire fleet. Only when his beloved companion Patroclus was killed by Hector while wearing Achilles' armor did the son of Peleus return to battle, driven by a grief and rage that made him more terrible than he had ever been before. The fury of Achilles was like a force of nature unleashed upon the Trojan army, cutting through their ranks like a scythe through wheat, pursuing them to the very gates of their city and challenging their greatest champion to single combat before the walls where all could witness. The duel between Achilles and Hector became the stuff of legend, two heroes at the peak of their powers fighting with skill and courage that seemed to transcend mortal limitations, but in the end the Greek warrior prevailed and Hector fell, his death marking the beginning of Troy's final agony. In his grief and rage, Achilles desecrated the body of his fallen enemy, dragging it around the walls of Troy behind his chariot for 12 days until the gods themselves intervened and the mourning King Priam came secretly to the Greek camp to ransom his son's remains. The death of Hector broke the spirit of Troy's resistance, for he had been not merely their greatest warrior but the heart and soul of their defense, the one man whose courage and leadership held the city together through 10 years of siege and suffering. Yet still the walls stood firm and the Greeks could find no way to breach them, while their own army grew smaller each day as disease and battle took their toll, and some warriors began to speak of abandoning the siege and returning home. It was then that Odysseus, whose cunning mind had already saved the Greek cause on many occasions, conceived the stratagem that would finally deliver Troy into their hands. If the city could not be taken by force, then it must be conquered by guile, and the plan he proposed was so audacious and brilliant that even his fellow kings doubted it could succeed. The construction of the great wooden horse took many weeks, for it had to be large enough to conceal a significant number of warriors within its hollow belly while appearing to be exactly what it seemed, a magnificent offering to the gods created by craftsmen at the height of their skill. The finest carpenters and artists in the Greek army labored over every detail, carving and painting and polishing until the horse was a masterwork of sculpture as well as engineering, beautiful enough to tempt the Trojans and sturdy enough to serve its hidden purpose. When the work was complete, 30 of the best Greek warriors climbed inside the hollow space within, led by Odysseus himself and including Menelaus, whose wife's return was the original cause of the war. The rest of the Greek army then performed an elaborate deception, burning their camp and sailing their ships away beyond the horizon as if finally abandoning the siege after 10 fruitless years, but in reality anchoring behind a nearby island where they could return quickly when the signal was given. The Trojans emerged from their city at dawn to find the beach empty except for the great wooden horse standing alone on the sand like some fantastic creature left behind by the retreating sea. Suspicious at first, they gradually convinced themselves that this was indeed a religious offering created by the departing Greeks, possibly an attempt to appease the gods for their failure to capture Troy. A Greek deserter, actually an agent of Odysseus, appeared and confirmed this interpretation with a carefully rehearsed story about how the horse was meant to ensure the Greeks' safe voyage home and how it would bring divine protection to whoever possessed it. Despite warnings from the priest Laocoon and the prophetess Cassandra, both of whom sensed divine displeasure in the seemingly generous gift, the majority of Trojans voted to bring the horse inside their city as a trophy of their victory over their longtime enemies. The task of moving the enormous wooden horse through Troy's gates required the partial destruction of the wall itself. But the Trojans were so eager to claim their prize that they gladly tore down a section of the fortifications that had protected them for 10 long years. All day they labored to drag the horse through their streets to the temple of Athena, celebrating their deliverance from siege with wine and song, dancing in the squares and embracing in the doorways of their homes as if the nightmare of war had finally ended. As darkness fell over the city, exhaustion from celebration overcame the population, and Troy settled into the deepest sleep it had enjoyed in a decade, with only a few guards remaining awake at their posts while the rest of the citizens dreamed of peace and prosperity restored. At midnight, When the city lay wrapped in slumber and the guards dozed at their stations, Odysseus and his companions emerged from their hiding place within the wooden horse like deadly spirits materializing from the realm of shadows. Moving silently through the darkened streets, they overwhelmed the few sentries they encountered and opened the gates of Troy to admit their comrades who had returned under cover of darkness and were waiting impatiently outside the walls. The Greek army poured into the sleeping city like a flood of bronze and iron, spreading through every district and quarter. And by the time the Trojans realized what was happening, it was far too late to organize an effective defense. The sack of Troy was terrible beyond description, a night of fire and blood that erased a civilization from the earth and left only ashes and memories where once the greatest city in the world had stood. Buildings that had housed generations of noble families were consumed by flames that turned the night sky red as blood, while in the streets warriors fought desperate battles amid piles of treasure and dead bodies. King Priam, aged and feeble, was cut down at the altar of Zeus where he had sought sanctuary, and his queen Hecuba was taken as a slave to serve in the household of her husband's killer. The infant son of Hector was hurled from the city walls to prevent him from growing up to avenge his father, while the women of Troy's royal house were distributed among the Greek heroes as prizes of war. Paris, whose theft of Helen had caused all this destruction, fell beneath the arrows of Philoctetes, and with his death the last hope of Trojan resistance died as well. Helen herself, the face that had launched 1,000 ships and brought about the destruction of Troy, was found by Menelaus in the palace where she had lived as Paris's wife for 10 long years. Some accounts say that he intended to kill her for her faithlessness, but when he looked upon her beauty once again, he found that his anger melted away like snow before the sun, and he took her back as his wife without punishment or reproach. Whether this was due to her own repentance, his continuing love, or some final spell cast by Aphrodite, none could say, but husband and wife were reunited over the ruins of the city that had died for her sake. The victorious Greeks loaded their ships with the accumulated treasures of generations, gold and silver and precious stones, fine fabrics and works of art, weapons and armor crafted by the finest smiths in Asia, everything of value that could be carried away from the burning ruins. But their triumph was not without cost, for many of the greatest heroes had fallen during the long siege, and those who survived found that the gods were not pleased with the excessive violence of Troy's destruction. The journey home would prove almost as perilous as the war itself, with divine wrath pursuing the Greek fleet across stormy seas, scattering the ships and destroying many of them before they could reach their native shores. Agamemnon, king of kings and leader of the Greek expedition, returned home to find that his wife Clytemnestra had not forgiven the sacrifice of their daughter Iphigenia and had taken a lover to share her throne and her bed. On the very night of his homecoming, as he bathed and prepared to enjoy the fruits of victory, she struck him down with an axe, claiming justice for their murdered child and ending the life of the man who had conquered Troy. His death began a cycle of vengeance that would consume his entire house and provide poets with material for tragedies that would be performed for centuries to come. Odysseus, whose cunning had made victory possible, was condemned by the gods to wander the seas for 10 years before reaching his home in Ithaca, facing trials and monsters that tested his wit and courage as severely as any battle he had fought on the plains of Troy. His story became a second epic as famous as the war itself, a tale of perseverance and homecoming that proved that even the cleverest of mortals could not escape the consequences of their actions. Achilles, the greatest warrior of his age, had fallen before Troy's gates when an arrow guided by Apollo struck his one vulnerable spot, his heel where his mother had held him when dipping him in the waters of immortality. His death was mourned throughout Greece, for men realized that they would never see his like again, and his fame became the standard by which all future heroes would be measured. The Trojans too had their heroes to remember, brave men who had fought against impossible odds to defend their homeland and their families, and their courage in defeat was perhaps even more admirable than Greek triumph in victory. The fall of Troy marked the end of an age, the passing of the Bronze Age world of heroes and gods into the darker Iron Age where mortals would have to find their own way without divine guidance or intervention. The great city was never rebuilt, its ruins gradually covered by grass and flowers until nothing remained but a hill overlooking the Hellespont where archaeologists many centuries later would dig to find traces of the walls that had once defied the combined might of Greece. The war that had begun with a quarrel between goddesses over a golden apple had consumed countless lives and destroyed the greatest civilization of its time, proving once again that when gods meddle in mortal affairs, the consequences are always far more terrible than anyone could have imagined. Yet from the ashes of Troy arose something greater than the city itself, the stories and songs that would immortalize both victors and vanquished, preserving their deeds for all time and inspiring countless generations with tales of courage and sacrifice, love and loss, triumph and tragedy. The Iliad and the Odyssey became the foundation stones of Western literature, while the story of Troy itself spread throughout the ancient world, told and retold in 100 different versions, adapted to serve the needs of each new age that discovered meaning in its timeless themes. Kings and emperors would claim descent from Trojan heroes, cities would boast of being founded by Trojan refugees, and the legend would prove more enduring than the bronze walls of the city that had inspired it. In the end, perhaps that was the true victory that emerged from the ruins of Troy. Not the temporary triumph of one army over another, but the eternal victory of human memory over oblivion, of story over silence, of art over death itself. The heroes of Troy, both Greek and Trojan, achieved the immortality they sought not through conquest or glory but through the power of words to preserve their deeds forever, ensuring that as long as humans tell stories to their children, the echo of their battles will continue to sound across the centuries, and the name of Troy will never be forgotten.